She hears nothing. An 88-year-old deaf widow walks alone across cracking ice to save her herd, trapped at 71 degrees as 10 bears surround everything, and no one imagined what she would do next. The silence was not empty. It was a pressure, a dense, unchanging medium that had defined Agrafena Petrova's 88 years. It wrapped the small, squat wooden structure she called home, muffling the already absent sounds of the Siberian wilderness. Her deafness, a gift delivered by a fever when she was 6, had sharpened the other senses to a painful degree. She felt the world not through air vibrations, but through the earth itself, the subtle shift of the permafrost beneath the floorboards, the groan of the structural timber reacting to the deep, shattering cold. Today, the cold was different. It was an enemy with teeth. Agrafena moved with the economy of a woman who had spent 8 decades minimizing energy expenditure against the Arctic's constant demand. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and perfectly balanced. She was bundled in layers of reindeer hide, the leather cured and softened by her own hands, using methods passed down through 20 generations of nomadic herders. Even inside the shelter, the air was so brittle that her breath, when expelled, instantly vaporized into a cloud of ice dust that settled quickly on the fur trimming of her hood. She knelt by the small stove, feeding it slivers of dried larch. The fire was the heart, the only barrier between life and the immediate crushing embrace of the kolod. She did not hear the crackle of the wood, but she saw the mesmerizing dance of the flames, blue at the core, yellow licking the iron, and felt the heat radiate outward, a temporary precious shield. The temperature had been dropping steadily for 3 days, but this morning, the world had entered a state of impossible stillness. Outside, the air was so dense with frozen moisture that it appeared white, like a solid gas. She had checked the thermometer hanging just inside the door, a modern, unnecessary intrusion her late husband Pyotr had insisted upon years ago, and the mercury had retreated entirely into the bulb, useless. But she did not need a gauge. She knew the cold by the way the metal clasp on her coat burned her gloved fingers through the leather, by the way the very ground seemed to tighten, threatening to split open the earth. This was not the usual winter cold of Yakutia, which settled comfortably around 50 degrees C. This was the hyper-freeze, the legendary 71 degrees C that broke records and shattered the natural order. It was the cold that warned the living that they were trespassers. Agrafena stood, her back straight despite the weight of her years and the heavy furs. Her eyes, the color of glacial ice, surveyed the interior of the yurta. Everything was organized, dried fish hanging from the rafters, bullets stacked neatly by the rifle rack, the leather repair kit ready. Her life was measured by readiness. She thought of the herd. 300 reindeer, the last tangible link to Pyotr, who had died 5 years ago, not from the cold, but from the quiet failure of a heart worn out by the vastness. They were currently miles away, in the traditional winter grazing grounds near Sakna, where the snow cover was usually shallow enough for them to reach the vital lichen. The thought of those 300 animals, the bloodline of her family and the only remaining legacy of the Petrova clan, was the engine that drove her. Her purpose was simple, relentless, and absolute: survival of the lineage. She moved to the window, a small, thick pane of glass layered with rime. She scraped a small circle clear with a fingernail. The monochrome landscape stretched out. White earth, white sky, and the deep, silent shadows of the frozen taiga. The sun was a pale, indifferent disk, offering light but no warmth. It was in the shadows that she first saw movement that was not natural. A figure, small and frantic, was running toward her dwelling from the northeast ridge, moving against the wind in short, stumbling bursts. The runner was Tuvun, a young messenger from the neighboring camp, known for his speed and his tendency toward panic. Agrafena braced herself, Tuvun would arrive exhausted, his face frozen, his lungs burning. She had to be ready to receive information that was likely delivered through gestures and frantic written notes, the only way to bypass her silent world. Tuvun reached the door, staggering. He didn't bother with the latch. He simply threw his body against the thick plank, bursting inside in a cloud of frozen air and snow. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping, his parka stiff with ice. Agrafena waited. She did not rush to help him to his feet, knowing that in this cold, panic was a greater killer than exhaustion. She knelt slowly, touching his shoulder, a steady, grounding pressure. Tuvun, a man usually verbose and full of nervous energy, was reduced to shivering silence. He pulled a thick piece of parchment from his inner pocket, already crumpled and stained with frozen moisture. His fingers were stiff, purple. He jammed the paper into Agrafena's hands. Agrafena took the note and smoothed it carefully. She had learned to read script by the time she was 10. Taught by a traveling priest, and the skill had become invaluable. The penmanship was Tuvun's, hurried and almost illegible, but the message was clear, burned into the page with a charcoal stick. Agrafena A. The herd is lost. She felt the words not as a shock, but as a cold, sickening certainty that settled in her gut. She looked up at Tuvun, whose eyes were wide and red-rimmed, searching her face for understanding. She pointed to the word lost. Tuvun nodded violently. He began to gesture, a frantic ballet of disaster. He pointed east, toward the vast, frozen expanse of the Lena River Delta. He mimed a massive, uncontrolled rush, the stampede. Then he used his hands to draw a huge, flat plain and placed his open palm on it, indicating the herd was trapped. He made a cracking motion with his hands, indicating the ice was breaking up. Agrafena's mind worked with the speed of a trapping wire snapping shut. The hyperfreeze had caused a massive pressure change. The air was so cold it could cause the river ice, miles wide and feet thick, to contract and groan, opening fissures. The reindeer, sensing the immediate danger and unable to reach the deeper lichen beneath the rock-hard snow, would have panicked, seeking open ground. They had run blindly onto the delta. She pointed to the parchment, searching for more detail. Tuvun, seeing her comprehension, pulled out a second, smaller note. This one contained only numbers and crude drawings. The numbers were horrifying. 300. The herd. Dear Sir, the predators. The drawings were unmistakable, huge, stylized silhouettes of bears. Tuvun jabbed his finger at the drawings, his face twisting into a silent, primal scream of fear. He spread his hands wide to indicate their size, then mimed tearing flesh. 10 bears, a mix of desperate brown bears, driven out of hibernation by the unprecedented cold and starvation, and the massive, opportunistic polar bears, pushed south from the coast by the collapsing sea ice. 10 apex predators converging on 300 defenseless reindeer trapped on a sheet of fracturing ice. The situation was beyond catastrophic. The reindeer were not just trapped, they were exposed, a buffet waiting for the inevitable slaughter. Agrafena crumpled the notes, feeling the brittle paper crunch in her glove. Tuvun was still gesturing, trying to communicate urgency. Go now! They are starving. She looked at the young man, his fear radiating off him like heat. Why are you here? She signed slowly, using the ancestral hand signs of the herders. Why didn't you help them? Tuvun dropped his gaze, shame mixing with terror. He pointed to the temperature outside, then to his own chest, indicating his failure. The cold was too deadly. No one would risk crossing the delta in these conditions. The journey was a guaranteed death sentence. Tuvun and the others had retreated, sending him to deliver the news to the owner of the herd, hoping she might somehow authorize the loss or, impossibly, send better-equipped men. But there were no better-equipped men. Her sons and grandsons lived hundreds of miles away in the city, assimilated into the modern world. their connection to the permafrost thin and theoretical. Agrafena was the last true Petrova herder. The herd was her responsibility, her blood, her history. She stood up, the decision forming in her mind with the clarity of ice crystal. Tuvun watched her, his breath catching. She walked to the rifle rack. It held Pyotr's old, heavy Mosin Nagant, a bolt-action rifle that had seen 3 generations of Siberian winters. It was battered, the wooden stock worn smooth by use, but meticulously maintained. She pulled it down, feeling the familiar, comforting weight. The rifle was a tool, a promise of last defense, but she knew that 10 starving bears could not be stopped by lead alone. She needed to move the herd. If the herd remained on the ice, they would die, either by the bears or by the inevitable tidal action and the continuing fracturing of the delta. She had to get them off the ice sheet and back onto the mainland, across the miles of barren, frozen expanse and into the higher, sheltered valleys where the ancient lichen grew. Tuvun, seeing the rifle, grabbed her arm, his eyes pleading. He shook his head violently, pointing to the door, then miming the crushing power of the cold. "You cannot go. It is too cold. You are old." Agrafena looked at his hand on her sleeve, then back into his fearful eyes. She knew the truth of his warning. To venture out now was madness. The cold at 71 Duntis strips the heat from a human body in minutes. Exposed skin freezes instantly. The breath freezes in the lungs. It was the kolod that was the true killer, the silent, omnipresent antagonist. But the alternative, the extinction of her lineage, the death of Pyotr's legacy, was unacceptable. The Petrova line did not end because of 10 hungry bears and a cold snap. She gently removed Tuvun's hand. She signed slowly, deliberately, using the signs for herd, family, now. Then she pointed to herself and signed herder. Tuvun understood. He sank back onto the floor, defeated, watching the old woman begin her preparations. Agrafena moved through the small space, gathering her supplies with the precision of ritual. She stuffed her leather satchel with dried eucalyptus and fish, dried bread, and a small flask of potent homemade spirit, not for drinking, but for treating frostbite. She checked the oil lantern and the small tin of tallow for the dogs. The dogs, they were her lifeline. She went outside to the small, sheltered kennel where they were curled, buried deep in the snow to conserve heat. There were 4 of them, but only 2 were strong enough for a long, grueling pull. Kolod, a massive white Yakutian Laika, and Tiger, the older, wiser leader. Kolod lifted his head, his breath steaming instantly. Agrafena knelt, ignoring the searing cold that immediately began to penetrate her layers. She ran her hand over Kolod's thick, double-layered fur. "We go, boy," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp in the silent air. She knew Kolod could not hear the sound, but he felt the vibration in her chest, the seriousness in her touch. Harnessing the dogs was a painful, meticulous task. The leather straps were stiff, the metal buckles instantly drawing heat from her thick gloves. She had to work quickly, minimizing the time she spent exposed. Next came the narta, the traditional long, narrow sled, built low to the ground to prevent tipping on rough ice. She lashed her supplies tightly, extra furs, a small, heavy axe, a coil of thick reindeer rope, and most crucially, the fire-starting material, dry tinder wrapped in oiled cloth, guarded like jewels. Fire was the only thing the bears feared, and the only thing that could save the herd from the cold. She loaded the rifle, cycling the bolt to ensure a round was chambered, the metallic click satisfyingly sharp in the stillness. She checked the action of the rifle one last time, her fingers moving over the worn metal. When she returned inside, Tuvun had managed to pull himself upright, leaning against the wall. He watched her, his face a mask of awe and despair. Agrafena pulled on her final layer, the massive outer coat of pristine white wolf fur, a coat Pyotr had hunted and prepared for her 50 years ago. It was heavy, perfectly insulating and made her blend seamlessly into the monochrome landscape. On her head, she settled a thick fur-lined cap that covered her ears entirely, completing her isolation. She gave Tuvun one final firm nod. She pointed to the stove, then to the remaining wood. "Stay here. Keep the fire." Then she turned and walked toward the door. As she reached for the latch, she paused, looking back at the tiny space that represented the sum of her domestic life. It was warm, safe, and silent. She was trading it for a silent, lethal wilderness where the air itself was trying to kill her. She pulled the door open. The air outside was a physical presence, a cold wall that hit her chest and stole her breath. The temperature had not risen. If anything, it felt deeper, more immediate. The landscape was terrifyingly beautiful, vast and empty under the pale, frozen sun. Agrafena Petrova, 88 years old, deaf and alone, stepped out into the 71 stilakid air, the rifle clutched in her hand, and set her face toward the distant cracking ice of the Lena River Delta. The fate of the Petrova lineage rested on her ability to outwit the Kolod and 10 hungry bears. She gave the dogs a firm, silent command, a tug on the lead rope. Kolod and Tiger strained into their harnesses, and the sled began to move, gliding over the hard-packed snow. The long, silent journey had begun. The birch runners of the Narta, polished smooth by decades of travel across the Siberian interior, whispered a high, crystalline vibration against the hard-packed snow. Agrafena felt the sound more than heard it, a constant, grating pressure in her bones that was momentarily louder than the generalized, heavy silence of the hyperfreeze. Kolod and Tiger pulled steadily, their massive bodies low to the ground, conserving every ounce of heat. Agrafena walked behind the sled, her hand resting lightly on the trailing edge, allowing the dogs to set the pace. Riding the sled was a luxury she could not afford. The exertion of walking was necessary to generate the internal heat required to ward off the Kolod. Every breath she expelled instantly turned to a cloud of fine ice dust that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating, a visible measure of the energy she was burning. The landscape was a study in monochrome brutality. The sun, still low and pale, cast shadows that were unnaturally sharp and deep, emphasizing the emptiness. There was no wind yet, which was a small mercy, but the stillness meant the cold was penetrating, immediate, and utterly relentless. It wrapped around her wolf fur garments, seeking the smallest seam, the slightest opening. She felt the burn of it on the edges of her eyelids, the only exposed skin, and blinked rapidly to keep the moisture from freezing. She focused entirely on the dogs and the ground. Her world, always silent, was now hypervisual. Kolod, the younger, stronger dog, was pulling with the eagerness of instinct, his tail low, but his stride powerful. Tiger, the leader, was older, wiser, and already showing the strain. Agrafena watched the subtle tightening of Tiger's shoulders, the slight hesitation before each push-off. They traveled for what felt like an eternity through the frozen taiga, the sparse, brittle trees offering occasional visual markers but little shelter. Agrafena was searching for the trail of the stampede. When she found it, it was unmistakable. A wide swath of disturbed snow, packed down hard, showing the panicked trajectory of 300 animals suddenly fleeing an unseen terror. The trail led due east, straight toward the heart of the Lena Delta. Following the herd's path was faster but also more dangerous. The reindeer, in their blind rush, had ignored obstacles that Agrafena and the sled now had to navigate: frozen stumps, deeply hidden rocks, and sudden icy dips. Twice, the Narta caught on a snag, wrenching to a halt. The shock traveled up the lead rope and into Agrafena's hands, a violent jolt in the silent world. She had to use her axe both times to clear the obstruction, the effort sending waves of heat through her body, quickly followed by the searing cold, attempting to reclaim it. As they cleared the last line of stunted larch trees, the full expanse of the river delta opened before them. It was truly vast, an endless flat plain of ice and snow stretching to the horizon, where the white of the ground merged seamlessly with the white of the sky. The sheer scale of the space was dizzying, erasing all sense of direction save for the constant pull of the herd's trail. The nature of the ice changed here. It was no longer the relatively stable riverbank ice, but the deeper, wider sheet of the delta, subject to immense geological pressures. Agrafena slowed the dogs, pulling gently on the lead rope. She stepped carefully, testing the ground. Her deafness had refined her sensitivity to vibration into a sixth sense. She could feel the difference between solid permafrost and unstable ice through the soles of her boots. Here the ice was thick, but it was alive. She felt the low, irregular thrumming beneath her feet, the soundless groan of the massive ice sheet contracting in the 71°C cold. It was the sound of millions of tons of frozen water resisting the laws of thermodynamics, and it was deeply unsettling. They had not gone a mile onto the open delta when she encountered the first major obstacle. A pressure ridge. The constant movement of the ice had forced a massive, jagged line of frozen water upward, creating a wall of sharp, fractured blue ice nearly 7 feet high. The herd had simply gone around it, but Agrafena needed to cross. A detour would cost hours. She unlashed the heavy axe from the sled and approached the ridge. The ice was hard as tempered steel. She lifted the axe, the weight familiar and comforting, and began to chip away at the lowest, most traversable point. Chip, chip, chip. The vibrations of the impact traveled up the wooden handle and into her arms, a rhythmic, exhausting pulse. She worked in short, furious bursts, pausing every few minutes to check her hands. Even through the thickest reindeer hide mittens, the axe handle felt impossibly cold, threatening to bond with her skin. After 20 minutes of brutal labor, she had cleared a narrow, sloping path barely wide enough for the sled. She led Kolod and Tiger through the gap, encouraging them with firm, silent pressure on their harnesses. They scrambled over the sharp remnants of the ice, their muscles straining. It was just past the pressure ridge that she found the first sign of the secondary antagonists. Agrafena stopped the dogs, holding the lead rope taut. She scanned the ground ahead, her glacial eyes sharp and unwavering. Near a small depression filled with wind-blown snow, the pristine white surface was marred by something dark. She walked forward slowly. It was scat, massive and dark against the white. She knelt, ignoring the cold that radiated up through her thick coat. It was still steaming slightly, indicating it was very fresh. She touched it lightly with a gloved finger, feeling the dense texture. Brown bear. Medved. Her stomach tightened, a cold knot of dread displacing the exhaustion. The bears were not just following the herd, they were moving fast, driven by the desperation of starvation. The hyperfreeze had destroyed their normal food sources, forcing them out of hibernation in a lethal hunt. She stood and looked around. The air was still. She saw nothing, but the presence of the predator was suddenly palpable, a heavy weight in the silence. She moved back to the sled, her movements more urgent now. She checked the rifle, ensuring the bolt was still locked down securely. They continued, following the herd's trail, which was now crisscrossed by other, heavier tracks. The Medved tracks were wide and heavy, often dragging slightly. But then she saw the others, the tracks of the polar bears, the Umka. They were larger, more defined, with a distinct 5-toe pattern and a much longer stride, indicative of a creature built for tireless, long-distance travel across ice. The polar bears were coming from the north, pushed south by the collapse of the coastal ice shelf. She counted the trails visually, tracing their convergence toward the east. Tuvun's count had been accurate. 10 distinct paths, merging into one overwhelming vector of hunger aimed directly at her herd. The reality of the confrontation settled over her. She was racing against 10 massive, starving killing machines, not just the elements. As the journey continued, the strain on the dogs became a central concern. Kolod, though powerful, began to pant heavily, visible clouds of ice mist marking his distress. Tiger, the elder, was starting to falter. Agrafena stopped again. She pulled a piece of dried Eucola from her satchel, the dried fish brittle and frozen solid, and broke it into portions. She fed the dogs by hand, talking to them in her low, rasping voice, the vibrations reassuring them even if the words were unheard. She examined Tiger's paws again. The translucent patches had spread. Frostbite was setting in. If she lost Tiger, the speed of the Nata would be halved and her mission would fail. She opened the flask of spirit. The homemade vodka so strong it was almost pure alcohol. She poured a small amount onto her glove and rubbed it vigorously into the affected areas of Tiger's paws, the alcohol burning away the surface ice and stimulating circulation. Tiger flinched, but endured the treatment with the stoic obedience of a dog that understood the stakes. Agrafena felt a sharp pang of guilt. She was pushing her companions to the absolute limit of their endurance, knowingly risking their lives for the lineage. But there was no choice. The Petrova herding dogs were bred for this. Their purpose was intertwined with the survival of the reindeer. She gave the command to move, and they continued, Tiger now running with a slightly higher, more desperate gait. The landscape began to shift again. The ground ahead was a chaos of broken white and dark grey, the unstable region of the delta where the ice was fracturing. This was where the herd was trapped. Agrafena felt the vibrations beneath her feet intensify. The low thrumming escalated into a rapid, irregular shudder. She had to slow her pace, testing every footfall. The risk of stepping onto a hidden fissure, masked by a thin layer of snow, was terrifyingly high. Her deafness, usually her strength, was now a critical vulnerability. She relied on the visual cues of the ice, the dark lines indicating deep cracks, the subtle changes in color that betrayed underlying water, the way the snow settled over an unstable void. But she lacked the crucial auditory warning, the high, sharp crack that signals imminent collapse, the groaning and sighing of the ice mass that gives a few precious seconds of reaction time. She was moving into a silent minefield. She saw the first major fissure. It was several hundred yards long, a dark, jagged scar across the delta. Unlike the pressure ridge, this was a split that went down to the water, which, despite the 70 air, was liquid beneath the ice, kept in motion by the river's current and insulated by the thickness of the sheet. The gap was only about 3 feet wide, but the sight of the viscous black water steaming slightly in the lethal cold was a profound shock. Falling in meant instant death. The herd's trail ran alongside the fissure, showing where they had been funneled by the obstacle. Agrafena had to follow the edge, searching for a place where the ice had buckled and bridged the gap. She found a suitable crossing point half an hour later. A smaller section of ice, pushed up by pressure, had wedged itself tightly between the two main sheets, creating a temporary, unstable bridge. She unhitched the dogs completely. She could not risk the sled falling in. She had to move the gear across piece by piece. First the rifle, secured tightly to her back, then the heavy axe and the fire-starting kit carried over her shoulder. Finally, she led Kolod and Tiger across the narrow, groaning span. As she stepped onto the central wedge of ice, she felt a profound, deep vibration, unlike anything she had experienced before. It was not the rhythmic thrum of contraction. It was a sudden, violent shudder, as if something enormous had struck the ice miles away. She froze instantly, her eyes wide, scanning the horizon. The shudder subsided quickly, leaving behind a nervous, continuous tremor. She hurried the dogs across the remaining distance. pulling them onto the relative stability of the far side. When she looked back, the wedge of ice she had just crossed was gone. The pressure had shifted, and the makeshift bridge had been swallowed by the black water, leaving the 3-foot gap yawning wide. The cold was not just the enemy, it was the mechanism of a vast, indifferent geological engine, and she had just narrowly escaped its crushing gears. The delay, though critical, had brought her something else: proximity. She re-harnessed the dogs and pushed on, following the tightly packed hoof prints. The snow here was churned and scattered, indicating the herd was no longer running, but milling in confusion. And then she saw them. In the distance, perhaps a mile and a half away, was a dark, huddled mass against the white. 300 bodies, packed together tightly for warmth, their heads low, their movement minimal. They were trapped on a relatively stable, large section of ice, surrounded on 3 sides by open fissures and the relentless threat of the Kolod. Agrafena felt a rush of fierce, desperate relief. They were alive. But immediately, that relief curdled into terror. The herd was not alone. Around the edges of the huddled mass, moving like pale, lethal shadows, were the bears. She counted them quickly, her vision piercing the distance. 10 figures. Some were the darker, shaggier silhouettes of the brown bears, already testing the edges of the perimeter. Others were the ghostly white shapes of the polar bears, blending almost perfectly with the landscape, their immense size betrayed only by the shadows they cast. The confrontation had already begun, though in a silent, terrifying prelude. The bears were not yet attacking. They were circling, testing the reindeer's cohesion, waiting for the weakest to falter or for the ice itself to break up the natural defense of the herd. They were waiting for the right moment to strike, conserving their energy in the lethal cold. Agrafena stopped the sled abruptly. She was too far to intervene effectively yet, but too close to hide. She needed to approach carefully, using the terrain to mask her final advance. She pulled out the binoculars, a modern gift from Pyotr that she rarely used but now cherished. She raised them to her eyes, adjusting the focus until the scene snapped into brutal clarity. The reindeer were terrified. Their heads were down, their breath rising in a nervous collective cloud. They were exhausted, starving, and now facing predators they could not outrun on the fractured ice. The bears were magnificent and horrifying. One massive polar bear, easily 10 feet tall when standing, was pacing slowly, its movements fluid and focused. Agrafena recognized the posture, patient, predatory intelligence. This was not a mindless charge. This was a siege. She lowered the binoculars, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. She had to get closer. She had to reach the herd before the bears launched their synchronized strike. She took a long swig of water from her flask, lukewarm thanks to the insulation, a shocking contrast to the air, and then poured the remainder over the metal components of the rifle to prevent any last-minute freezing of the action. She looked at Kolod and Tiger. They sensed the proximity of the predators. Their ears, or what Agrafena perceived as their intense focus, pricked forward. Their bodies tense. Agrafena decided on her approach. She would leave the sled here, hidden behind a low mound of wind-drifted snow. She would take only the essential tools, the rifle, the axe, and the fire kit. The dogs would wait, their presence too visible, their scent too easily detectable by the Umka. She unhitched the dogs and secured them to the heaviest part of the sled, giving them a final, reassuring touch. Wait. Stay. Then she began her final silent approach, moving low to the ground, using the subtle contours of the ice and snow for cover. The distance was about a mile, but every yard felt like scaling a cliff face. The silence of her world was now oppressive, amplifying the intensity of her focus. She could not hear the scrabble of the bear's claws on the ice, the nervous snorts of the reindeer, or the wind beginning to rise, whipping the snow into stinging needles. She relied entirely on sight and vibration. The wind was the next enemy, A sudden, violent gust swept across the delta, carrying with it a fine, abrasive ice fog. The temperature, already impossible, was dropping further due to the wind chill, driving the effective cold into a realm where flesh froze in seconds. Agrafena squinted, pulling the wolf fur hood tighter around her face. She felt the wind not as a sound, but as a heavy, physical force pushing against her, stealing her heat reserves. She had to hurry. The wind would obscure the bear's movements, making her job infinitely harder. She pressed forward, low to the ground, her body a white shadow against the white expanse. She focused on the largest polar bear, the leader of the siege, watching its slow, deliberate circuit. She closed the distance to half a mile. She could now clearly see the suffering of the herd, the way the weakest were already separating themselves from the tightly knit center. It was then that the first brown bear made its move. It was not a full attack, but a test. The large medved lunged suddenly, snapping at the flank of a young cow near the perimeter. The cow panicked, pulling away, and the sudden movement caused a chain reaction in the huddled herd. The tight formation began to loosen, giving the bears the opening they needed. The bears reacted instantly. They shifted from patient circling to rapid, synchronized movement. The attack was beginning. Agrafena felt a jolt of pure adrenaline, overriding the exhaustion and the cold. She was still too far. She had to force the pace, risking exposure. She broke cover and ran, moving with a speed that belied her 88 years, driven by the absolute necessity of preserving her lineage. The rifle was held ready, but she knew the bullets were only a distraction. She needed fire. She needed to scatter the herd and the bears simultaneously. As she ran, the ice beneath her feet began to shudder violently again, not the slow contraction, but a rapid, rhythmic tremor that spoke of imminent disaster. The wind was rising to a howling fury, the surface of the delta becoming a blinding, white blur. She was within a quarter-mile of the herd when she saw the catastrophic result of the bear's initial pressure. A panicked group of 20 reindeer broke away from the main cluster, stampeding blindly toward a large, dark fissure. The polar bear leader saw the break and accelerated, a white missile aimed at the fleeing group. Agrafena stopped, dropped to one knee, and raised the Mosin Nagant. She did not aim for the bear. She aimed for the ice next to the bear. She chambered around, felt the familiar heavy resistance of the bolt, and took a deep, freezing breath. She was deaf, so she would not hear the report. But she would feel the recoil, the shockwave of the blast, traveling through the air and the ice. Her target was the ice, hoping the sudden, localized shock would confuse the bears and, more importantly, stop the panicked reindeer from plunging into the fissure. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a violent, satisfying shove. The air around the muzzle erupted in a white flash of burning powder. She saw the impact point instantly, a small, dark spiderweb of fractured ice right beside the leading polar bear's massive paw. The shockwave traveled through the ice. The bear flinched, pausing its charge, momentarily confused by the sudden violent tremor. The fleeing reindeer, sensing the immediate localized instability, braked hard, turning away from the fissure. Agrafena had bought herself 5 seconds. She didn't wait to see the outcome. She stood and ran again, her feet pounding across the groaning ice, heading directly toward the main herd, where the other 9 bears were now preparing their full, coordinated assault. She had announced her presence. Now, the silent race to save the Petrova line had become a desperate physical confrontation against 10 apex predators and the crushing cold. She had reached the battlefield. The ice sheet was groaning, ready to shatter, and the bears were turning their attention toward the new, small threat dressed in white wolf fur. The sudden, violent shove of the rifle's recoil against Agrafena's shoulder was the loudest sensation in her world. It was a physical blow that momentarily eclipsed the deep, grinding tremor of the ice beneath her feet. She did not hear the crack of the Mosin Nagant, but she saw the muzzle flash, a white-hot burst of combustion that instantly vanished in the -71-degree air. The shot achieved its immediate goal. The immense polar bear, the Umka, hesitated, its great white head snapping up, not in fear of the small projectile, but in confusion at the sudden, localized shockwave that had traveled through the ice. The 20 stampeding reindeer, their momentum broken by the sudden instability, turned away from the fissure, bumping into the main, huddled cluster. Agrafena did not pause to admire the effect. She was running again. Pumping her legs hard across the treacherous surface, she had announced her presence. Now she had to capitalize on the momentary distraction. The distance closed rapidly, fueled by the primal necessity of her mission. As she drew closer, the scene resolved from a blur of white fur and dark shadows into a tableau of desperate terror. The herd was a single panicked organism, pressed so tightly that the weaker animals were already beginning to suffocate. Their breath rose in a single massive plume of ice vapor that momentarily hid the center of the cluster. The 10 bears, however, had ceased their circling. They had registered the new threat. A single, small figure moving toward the herd. They were not accustomed to resistance. Their prey was supposed to be passive, trapped, and waiting. The lead, Umka, recovering from the shock, fixed its gaze on Agrafena. It was enormous, its fur thick and yellowed, its massive head low. It began to move toward her, not running, but walking with a heavy, deliberate stride that conveyed absolute, unstoppable power. The ice groaned beneath its weight, sending a distinct, low-frequency vibration through the ground that Agrafena felt keenly in her boots. She was now within 50 yards of the herd's perimeter. The smell of the animals, a musky, hot scent of fear and unwashed fur, was strong even in the paralyzing cold. She could see the wide, fearful eyes of the nearest reindeer. The danger was twofold. The bears were converging, and the sheer terror of the herd meant they were ready to stampede again, likely driving themselves into the deadly fissures. Agrafena skidded to a stop just outside the immediate cluster. She couldn't afford to be trampled. Her priority was not shooting, but fire. She dropped the rifle and, without looking away from the advancing Umka, ripped open the flap of her satchel. Her gloved fingers, thick and clumsy, fumbled for the fire kit, the small tin containing the tallow, the dry tinder, and the flint and steel. The wind, which had been rising steadily, now hit her with the full force of a squall, whipping the snow into a horizontal sheet. The wind chill was now beyond comprehension, a lethal solvent stripping all heat. She knelt, using her body and the sled's remaining supplies as a temporary windbreak. She needed a flame, instantly. She pulled out the oiled cloth and the tinder, placing the small bundle on a flat, frozen rock she had brought specifically for this purpose. She struck the steel against the flint. The sparks were tiny, yellow-orange pinpricks, visible for a fraction of a second before the cold consumed their energy. Strike, strike, strike. The intense cold made the process agonizing. Her fingers, though gloved, began to ache with the deep, penetrating bite of the air. She felt the skin tightening beneath the leather. She could not afford to take the glove off, even for a moment, but the lack of dexterity was costing her precious seconds. The Umka was closer now, perhaps 30 yards away, its stride powerful and economical. It was not charging yet, but stalking, assessing the small, kneeling figure. One of the brown bears, less patient and driven by a more immediate frantic hunger, broke rank. It charged the herd on the far side, aiming for a weak-looking calf. Agrafena ignored the brown bear. She had to focus on the immediate strategic threat, the Umka and the fire. The brown bear would kill one or two, but the polar bear would crush her defense entirely. Finally, on the 7th strike, a spark caught the oiled cloth. A tiny, miraculous wisp of smoke curled upward, instantly flattened by the wind. She blew gently, carefully, protecting the ember with her cupped hands. The heat of her breath, though freezing, was enough to feed the spark. The ember glowed red. She quickly added a sliver of dried larch bark. The flame sputtered weak and blue. She reached for the flask of spirit, her last resort. She uncorked the stopper with her teeth and poured a small, controlled stream of the powerful alcohol onto the tinder. Whoosh! The spirit ignited instantly, sending a column of yellow-white flame roaring upward, fighting briefly against the wind before settling into a fierce, contained burn. The heat, though negligible in the vastness of the cold, was immediate and visual. Agrafena grabbed the burning tinder and shoved it onto the end of a long, dried stick she had prepared, her fire lance. She stood, the flame dancing wildly, a tiny, defiant beacon in the white hell. The bears reacted. The brown bear that had charged the calf recoiled instantly from the sight of the fire, its instinct overriding its hunger. The other bears paused, their movements arrested by the sudden, terrifying appearance of the flame. But the Umka was different. It did not stop. It was too close, too desperate, and too intelligent to be deterred by a small flame. It shifted its focus entirely from the herd to Agrafena, recognizing her as the source of the defense, and therefore the primary target. The polar bear launched its charge. It was not a silent rush. The deep, heavy thud of its paws hitting the ice transmitted through the ground like a series of small, rhythmic explosions. Agrafena felt the vibrations rise rapidly in intensity, a countdown to impact. She had no time to reload the rifle, which lay abandoned by the sled. She had only the fire lance and the axe still lashed to her belt. She took 3 quick steps back, positioning herself between the charging bear and the tightest cluster of reindeer. She raised the burning stick high, screaming silently into the wind, her face a mask of primal fury. The Gumka did not waver. It was going to run right through the fire. Agrafena braced herself. At the last possible second, when the bear's massive yellowed claws were scraping the ice just yards away, she threw the fire lance. It struck the bear not on its face, but on its chest, embedding itself in the thick fur. The alcohol-fueled flame flared violently, momentarily igniting the surface hair. The bear stopped instantly, not from pain, but from the shock of the heat against its cold, adapted body. It roared, a silent, massive vibration that shook the air and the ice, making Agrafena's teeth ache. It swiped at the flame, extinguishing it with a massive paw. But the delay was enough. Agrafena used the fraction of a second to grab the Mosin Nagant. She cycled the bolt, chambering the next round, her movements precise and automatic. The other bears, witnessing the clash, took their cue. The momentary shock of the fire was gone, replaced by the overwhelming collective scent of bloodlust and starvation. 4 brown bears and 3 other polar bears began to charge the perimeter simultaneously, attacking the herd on 3 different sides. The remaining 2 bears, however, did not charge the herd. They joined the leader, converging on Agrafena. She was now facing 3 massive polar bears and 2 brown bears, all focused on eliminating the source of resistance. Agrafena fired again, aiming high over the head of the Umka, hoping the shockwave would disorient it further. The recoil hit, and the bear flinched, but did not retreat. It was merely annoyed. She realized with a sickening clarity that the rifle was useless as a deterrent. She had perhaps 6 rounds left and 10 bears. Killing one would only infuriate the others and expose her to instant retaliation. She needed to move the herd, but the bears were now blocking every exit. The ice shuddered again, a deeper, more sustained vibration this time. Agrafena looked down and saw it. A new fissure, thin as a thread, snaking rapidly across the ice surface directly between her and the main cluster of reindeer. The ice was giving way. The Kolod was turning the battlefield against her. She was momentarily isolated, separated from the herd by the rapidly widening fissure. The reindeer, sensing the immediate deadly instability, began to panic again, moving toward the center of the ice sheet, away from the edges and away from the mainland. The Umka saw its opportunity. It let out another silent, earth-shaking rumble and bounded toward the fissure. Its weight was too great for the thin ice near the edge. Crack! Agrafena saw the ice buckle and shatter beneath the polar bear's front paws. The bear plunged not entirely into the water, but deep enough that its massive chest hit the black surface. The bear thrashed, scrambling desperately to gain purchase on the fractured edge. Agrafena had a clear shot at its head, a clean, decisive kill. But killing the leader would signal a stampede among the herd, and the other 9 bears would tear into the defenseless animals. She made the only choice that served the lineage. She lowered the rifle, conserving the shot. The bear, using its immense strength, pulled itself free, soaking wet and furious. The liquid water instantly began to freeze on its thick fur, creating a brittle, icy armor. It was now even more dangerous, driven mad by the shock of the cold water and the need to warm itself. It turned its rage directly on Agrafena. The fissure, now 3 feet wide, lay between them. The Umka did not hesitate. It crouched low, gathering its muscles, and leaped. It was a terrifying, silent flight across the gap. The bear landed heavily on Agrafena's side of the fracture, its claws finding purchase on the stable ice. Agrafena dropped the rifle and reached for the axe. She knew she could not outrun it, and she could not shoot it at this range. This was a battle of close quarters, a desperate final stand for the Petrova lineage. The bear charged. Agrafena did not try to kill it. She aimed for the softest, most vulnerable point she could reach, the snout. She swung the heavy axe in a wide, desperate arc. The dull thud of the impact traveled through the wooden handle and into her arms, a sickening jolt. The bear shrieked, a massive, silent vibration of agony. The blow had not been fatal, but it had connected, jarring the bear and momentarily breaking its charge. The Umka reared up, momentarily distracted, shaking its massive head, its focus shattered. Agrafena used the time to retreat, scrambling backward toward the sled, where she had left the thick coil of rope. She needed to create a diversion, not win a fight. The other bears, seeing their leader wounded and temporarily confused, pressed their advantage against the herd. The reindeer, already stressed by the localized battle, began to break apart into smaller, more manageable clusters. The crisis was escalating rapidly. Agrafena was now engaged in a personal, brutal duel with the largest predator, while the rest of the herd was being systematically dismantled by the remaining 9. She reached the sled and grabbed the rope. She looped one end quickly, forming a heavy, weighted snare. The Umka dropped back onto all fours, shaking off the daze, blood staining the white fur of its snout. It was focused, lethal, and now utterly committed to her destruction. Agrafena knew she couldn't outrun it, but she had to buy time to rally the herd. She turned and ran, not away from the bear, but along the edge of the fissure, drawing the Umka away from the main cluster of reindeer. The bear followed, its heavy stride quickly closing the distance. Agrafena waited until the last second, then pivoted sharply, throwing the weighted rope low, aiming for the bear's legs. The rope was heavy, but the throw was imperfect. It snagged only one massive hind leg. The Umka stumbled, its momentum carrying it forward, but the sudden, awkward resistance threw its balance off. It hit the ground with a massive, jarring impact that sent a fresh wave of cracking through the ice sheet. Agrafena didn't look back. She snatched up the rifle and ran toward the herd, now scattered and vulnerable. She had to get them moving. She had to use the one thing they still responded to, the ancestral knowledge of the herder. She reached the largest remaining group, perhaps 200 animals, huddled near the center of the ice. She ran alongside them, using her body and the rifle stock to push them toward the predetermined exit point, the narrowest, most stable-looking route back toward the mainland. The reindeer, seeing the familiar shape of their herder and sensing the immediate threat behind them, responded instinctively. They began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. driven by the pressure of Agrafena's presence and the soundless terror of the bears. But the bears were already tearing into the smaller, peripheral groups. Agrafena saw a brown bear drag a young doe down, the violent, silent struggle visible even through the swirling snow. The scent of blood, faint but distinct, was now carried on the wind, driving the remaining predators into a frenzy. Agrafena fired the rifle one last time, aiming at the ice near the feeding brown bear. The shockwave was barely noticeable now, swallowed by the rising wind and the continuous groaning of the fracturing ice. The bear flinched, but did not release its prey. She was out of time and options. She had to commit fully to the evacuation. She reached the front of the moving column, pushing them toward the critical path. The ice here was thick, but marked by long, deep, dark lines, fissures waiting to open. She needed the dogs. The dogs were her only means of controlling the movement and direction of the herd in this chaos. She looked back toward the low mound where she had left Kolod and Tiger, hidden beside the sled. The distance was perhaps half a mile, straight across the most unstable part of the delta, and then she saw them. The two bears she had not accounted for, a polar bear and a brown bear, had found the sled. They had been drawn by the scent of the dogs and the tallow. The dogs were fighting. Kolod, massive and loyal, was struggling valiantly against the polar bear, a desperate, silent tangle of white and yellow fur. Tiger, the older leader, was pinned beneath the brown bear. Agrafena felt a cold, paralyzing dread that surpassed even the fear of death. Her lifeline, her only means of escape and control, was under attack. Tiger, her oldest companion, was being killed. She could not leave the herd. If she went back for the dogs, the herd would scatter and the lineage would be lost. If she stayed with the herd, the dogs would die and she would be stranded on the ice with 300 panicked animals and 10 hungry bears. The Umka, having freed itself from the rope, was now running hard toward the moving column of reindeer, intent on breaking their momentum. Agrafena was caught in the ultimate, terrifying bind. The fate of her family, her legacy, and her companions hung in a single, frozen moment. She made the only decision a Petrova herder could make. The lineage must survive. She turned her back on the silent, brutal struggle involving the dogs. The betrayal was a physical pain, colder than the Arctic air. She gripped the rifle and, using it as a prod, began to push the lead reindeer forward, driving them onto the narrow, dangerous path. "Move!" she yelled, the sound a dry, useless rasp in the wind, but the physical force of her effort was enough. "Move! Move! Move!" The herd began to accelerate, sensing the desperate urgency. The Umka was closing fast on the tail of the column. It lunged, grabbing the flank of a large buck. The buck went down, its cry a silent, violent vibration that traveled through the ice. Agrafena couldn't stop. She had to maintain the flow. She had to sacrifice the few to save the many. She ran ahead of the main column, looking for the crucial landmark, the point where the ice sheet connected back to the stable riverbank, miles away. The wind was now a constant, deafening roar against her fur hood, though she heard nothing. The ice beneath her feet was no longer groaning, it was fracturing. She saw the first catastrophic fissure open directly in the path of the herd. It was 5 feet wide, a yawning, steaming chasm of black water, instantly barring their escape route. The lead reindeer balked, turning back into the main column, creating a terrifying bottleneck. The animals behind them, pushed by the momentum, piled up, crushing each other against the edge of the chasm. The Umka and the other bears saw their opportunity. They charged the immobilized, panicked mass. Agrafena stopped at the edge of the fissure. The crisis had reached its peak. The herd was trapped, the bears were closing in for the final slaughter, and she was alone, without her dogs, facing the impossible chasm. She looked across the 5 feet of steaming, lethal water. The stable bank was still miles away. She had to cross, she had to lead them, but the reindeer were paralyzed by the threat of the black water, a fear more potent than the bears. Agrafena realized she had to do something utterly reckless, something that would break the collective paralysis. She placed the rifle on the ice, pulled out the heavy coil of rope again, and lashed one end securely around her waist. She took the axe, and with a final, desperate look at the churning mass of reindeer and the bears closing in, she prepared to jump the fissure. She was 88 years old, carrying the weight of the Petrova lineage. The jump was impossible, a guaranteed slide into the freezing water, but she had to demonstrate the way. She took a running start. Ignoring the deep, shattering tremors beneath her feet, she leaped, aiming for the far edge of the ice. She felt the terrible, brief sensation of flying, followed by the sickening, jarring impact of landing short. Her boots hit the far edge, but the ice was brittle. It cracked instantly. She scrabbled desperately, her gloved hands clawing for purchase. For a terrifying second, she hung suspended over the black water. Her weight was too much. The ice gave way. Agrafena Petrova plunged into the Lena River. The shock of the water, insulated by the thick layers of fur, was still absolute. It was a physical blow that stole her breath and instantly began to strip the heat from her body. The heavy furs, designed to repel snow, instantly absorbed the water, turning her into a leaden weight. She sank quickly into the black, viscous current. Her only salvation was the rope tied around her waist. The force of her fall and the sudden tension in the rope caused the loop on the near side of the fissure to catch on a sharp protrusion of ice. Agrafena fought the water, kicking desperately, her lungs burning in the silent, suffocating dark. She managed to pull herself upward, fighting the crushing weight of the soaked furs. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she reached the edge and clawed her way back onto the ice, coughing silently, her body shivering violently, steam instantly rising from her soaked garments. She lay on the ice, gasping, the cold now an internal, overwhelming force, a death sentence already issued. She was alive, but soaked, exposed, and entirely alone on the far side of the chasm, separated from the herd. The reindeer, witnessing the impossible spectacle of their herder plunging into the abyss and surviving, were momentarily stunned. The Umka, however, saw only weakness. It was now standing at the edge of the fissure, looking down at Agrafena, its eyes fixed on the small, shivering figure. It knew the water had delivered the final blow. Agrafena pulled the rope free from her waist, her hands numb and useless. She looked at the herd, then back at the bear. She was defeated. The Kolod had won. The bears would feast, and the Petrova lineage would end here, on the fractured, wind-swept ice. She looked at the axe, still clutched in her frozen hand, and prepared to face the Umka one last time. But then she saw movement on the far side of the fissure, near the stalled herd. Kolod, the giant Yakutian Laika, battered and bleeding, had somehow broken free from the brown bear. He was standing on the edge of the chasm, his attention focused entirely on the herd. He had seen Agrafena's jump, understood the sacrifice, and knew his new, immediate duty. Kolod let out a silent, deep vibration of distress and loyalty. He turned his massive body toward the panicked reindeer and, using his shoulders and teeth, began to push the lead animals toward the fissure. He was showing them the way. If the herder could cross, they could cross. The reindeer, seeing the familiar, powerful dog lead the charge, hesitated for only a second. Then, driven by the combined terror of the bears behind them and the desperate loyalty of the dog ahead, the first few animals leaped across the chasm, landing safely on Agrafena's side. Agrafena, shivering uncontrollably, understood. She was not the leader now. She was the beacon. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her lungs and the immediate deadly cold gripping her soaked furs. She grabbed the rifle and aimed it at the Umka, which was still assessing the jump. The bear had to be stopped now, or the entire effort would fail. Agrafena fired, not at the bear, but at the ice directly beneath the bear's front paws. The shot connected. The already fractured ice gave way completely. The Umka, massive and furious, plunged deep into the black water. This time, it was not merely soaked, it was submerged. The soundless roar of the bear's struggle was a massive vibration that traveled through the entire ice sheet, and the sight of its flailing, desperate effort to escape the freezing water was a terror that momentarily stunned the other bears. The brief reprieve was all Khulud needed. He continued to push the herd, driving them one by one across the fissure, following the improbable path of their herder. Agrafena, leaning heavily on the rifle, watched the stream of her lineage leap across the chasm. She was freezing, defeated by the Khulud. But the herd was moving. She had survived the plunge, but she had traded safety for a certain slow death by hypothermia. The cold was crushing her, turning her vision grey at the edges. She had to keep the path open. She had to hold the line until the last reindeer crossed. The remaining bears were now scrambling, realizing their prey was escaping. They gathered at the edge of the fissure, unwilling to risk the leap or the water, but ready to attack the last few animals. Agrafena raised the rifle again, her movements agonizingly slow, her fingers already losing sensation inside the frozen gloves. She had 2 rounds left. The final confrontation was not with the Umka, which was still struggling in the water, but with the combined desperate hunger of the remaining 9 bears separated from her by the chasm, but ready to destroy the last of the Petrova line. She stood alone, soaked and freezing, the silent, terrible wind whipping around her, the last guardian of the herd. The herd streamed across the chasm, a continuous, desperate torrent of life, driven by the primal terror of the bears and the powerful, silent command of Khulud. Agrafena, soaked and freezing on the far bank, leaned heavily on the rifle, her vision tunneling, the edges of the world dissolving into a grey blur. The water that saturated her wolf fur was instantly turning to ice, encasing her in a shell of lethal cold. Every breath was a searing pain, and the tremor that shook her body was not fear, but the deep, internal convulsion of hypothermia setting in. She raised the rifle, her movements sluggish and clumsy, aimed at the mass of 9 bears gathered on the opposite bank. They were frantic, their siege broken, their prey escaping one by one. They paced the edge of the fissure, growling silently, testing the ice, but the fate of their leader, the Umka thrashing helplessly in the black water, had instilled a profound caution. The Umka was still struggling. Its massive body, encased in a rapidly forming layer of ice, was heavy and slow. It managed to haul itself halfway out of the water, resting its chest on the broken lip of the ice. But the water had sealed its fate. The 70 Bufradixi air was doing the work Agrafena's bullets could not, turning the living beast into a frozen monument. Agrafena focused on the nearest threat, a large brown bear, its eyes gleaming with frantic hunger, preparing to make the leap. It crouched low, calculating the distance. Agrafena had 2 rounds left. She could not afford to miss. She aimed not at the bear, but at the ice directly in front of the animal's front paws, where the fissure was narrowest. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil was weaker now, her shoulder too numb to absorb the shock fully. The bullet struck the ice with a visible impact, shattering the brittle surface, and sending a spray of frozen fragments into the bear's face. The shockwave traveled through the ice, loud enough in her bone-deep silence to momentarily confuse the predator. The bear aborted its jump, scrambling backward as the ice beneath it groaned and settled lower, widening the gap slightly. 1 round left. The stream of reindeer was thinning. Perhaps 30 animals remained on the far side, pushed by Khulud toward the crossing point. The dog was a blur of frantic action, nipping flanks, barking silently, his focus absolute. Agrafena felt the cold consuming her, pulling her down into the sleep of the permafrost. She fought it with sheer will, focusing on the movement of the herd. She had to hold the line for the final animals. The remaining bears, realizing the window was closing, began to converge on the last few reindeer. They lunged and grabbed, pulling down the weakest animals that had failed to keep pace. The silent violence was terrifyingly efficient. Agrafena raised the rifle again. Her last bullet was not for the bears, it was for the ice. She aimed across the fissure, this time at a small, critical piece of ice that formed a temporary bridge near the tail of the escaping column, a piece that could support a bear's weight. She fired. The impact was definitive. The ice fractured completely, separating the last few yards of stable ground from the main crossing point. The remaining bears were now cut off entirely, separated from the bulk of the herd by a wide, unbridgeable chasm of black water. Agrafena had secured the perimeter. The herd was safe. She watched the last few reindeer scramble across the fissure, propelled by Kolod's final, powerful push. The dog himself was the last to cross. He gathered his muscles and leaped, his landing solid and true on the far bank. He paused only for a moment, looking back at the 9 frustrated, furious bears howling silently across the chasm and the struggling, immobilized Umka in the water. Then Kolod turned, his duty to the herd momentarily satisfied, and rushed toward Agrafena. She was collapsing. The shock of the freezing water and the relentless Kolod had finally overwhelmed her 88 years of endurance. She felt her knees buckle, and the rifle slipped from her numb fingers, clattering silently onto the ice. Kolod reached her, just as she pitched forward. She felt the massive, warm body of the Laika press against her, the rough fur a painful, welcome friction. Kolod nudged her, pushing his head beneath her arm, trying to force her upright. Agrafena could not respond. Her muscles were seizing, her mind retreating into the silent dark. She saw Kolod's frantic, focused face, his eyes wide with urgency, but she could not move. The dog, realizing she was paralyzed, acted on instinct. He grabbed the thick leather belt of her soaked wolf fur coat and began to pull. It was a slow, agonizing process. Agrafena was impossibly heavy, a dead weight encased in ice. Kolod strained, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth ice, pulling her away from the edge of the fissure and toward the distant, stable mainland bank. She was vaguely aware of the motion, the rhythmic strain of the dog's body, the continuous scraping of her frozen form across the ice. The cold was now a deep, narcotic numbness, erasing pain and thought. She lost track of time. Minutes, maybe hours, passed in a silent grey haze. When consciousness returned, it was not with a jolt, but with a searing internal burn. Kolod had stopped dragging her. He had managed to pull her onto a patch of stable, snow-covered permafrost, away from the treacherous delta ice. Agrafena's eyes fluttered open. The sky was still a pale, indifferent white, but the relentless wind had died down, replaced by the heavy, penetrating stillness of the deepest cold. She was lying beneath a small, stunted larch tree, its branches brittle with frost. Kolod was curled tightly against her side, his body radiating a life-saving animal heat. She was alive, but the victory was provisional. She was still soaked, and the water in her furs was now a solid, impenetrable layer of ice. If she remained immobile, she would freeze solid within the hour. The Kolod was waiting patiently for her to give up. Agrafena forced her fingers to move. The pain was excruciating, like sharp needles being driven into the bone. She had to start a fire. Now. She pushed Kolod gently away, ignoring the dog's low, silent whine of protest. She reached for her satchel, which Kolod had somehow dragged with her, finding the small tin of tallow and the last remnants of the dry tinder. Her hands were useless. They refused to articulate, locked by the cold. She had to use her mouth. She peeled back the layers of her frozen glove with her teeth, exposing the skin of her right hand. The air instantly seared the flesh. She felt the familiar, Terrifying burn of frostbite beginning immediately. She ignored the pain, focusing on the task. She managed to open the tin of tallow with agonizing slowness, using her teeth and the base of her thumb. She pulled out the flint and steel. The process was slow, agonizing and clumsy. The metal was so cold it felt like fire against her skin. She struck the flint against the steel, the sparks falling uselessly onto the icy ground. She needed a better base. She used her frozen left arm to scrape away the snow, exposing the bare, rock-hard earth. She struck again. Click, click, click. Collard watched her, his breath steaming rapidly, his body tense. He knew the fight was not over. On the 10th strike, a spark caught the dry tinder. It was a tiny, fragile ember, fighting for existence in the lethal air. Agrafena pulled the flask of spirit from the satchel. Her exposed hand was screaming now, white and numb. She poured the last drops of the potent alcohol onto the tinder. The flame erupted instantly, a magnificent, roaring beacon of yellow and blue. It was not a large fire, but it was fire. She fed it slowly, carefully, with slivers of larch bark, nurturing the fragile life force. The heat, though localized, was a profound spiritual relief. She worked quickly, peeling off the outer layer of her soaked wolf fur coat. The ice shell was so rigid it cracked like armor. She stripped down to her inner reindeer hide garments, which were damp but not saturated. She held her exposed, frostbitten hand directly over the flame, allowing the heat to drive back the cold. The pain, when the circulation returned, was blinding, but she endured it, knowing it was the price of survival. As the fire grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the monochrome landscape, Agrafena finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. She sat back against the tree, wrapped in Collod's protective warmth, watching the flames. The herd. She had to find the herd. She pushed herself to stand. The exhaustion was a crushing weight, but the fire had given her a temporary, desperate reprieve. She looked out across the stable mainland ice. The trail of the 300 reindeer was clear, leading away from the delta and toward the higher ground where the ancestral lichen grew. They were safe. The lineage had survived. Agrafena saw the cost of the victory immediately. She looked back toward the delta, toward the low mound where she had left the sled and Tiger. The distance was too great to see clearly, but the silent truth settled upon her. Tiger, the wise leader, was gone. She had felt the deep, agonizing pang of having to turn her back on him, and the subsequent rush of Collod's solitary arrival. The old dog had paid the ultimate price for the survival of the herd. The Petrova line had been preserved, but the cost was measured in the life of her oldest companion. Agrafena knelt, her head bowed in a moment of silent, profound grief that the Collod could never touch. She had survived the hyperfreeze, the ice, and the 10 predators, but she had lost a part of herself. She stood again, the fire warming her back. She looked at Collod, who was watching her intently, sensing the shift in her mood. She reached out and placed her numb, aching hand on his massive head. The dog leaned into her touch, a silent promise of loyalty renewed. She needed to secure the herd before the other bears, having digested their initial kills, tracked them onto the mainland. She had to move. She retrieved the rifle, checking the empty chamber. It was now merely a heavy club, a symbol of authority. She gathered the remaining supplies and lashed them tightly to Collod's harness. She would walk. Collod would carry the weight. They set off, following the clear trail of the 300 animals. The journey inland was slow but steady. The cold was still absolute, but here on the mainland, the ground was stable and the wind was less ferocious. The landscape began to change, the flat white giving way to rolling hills and sparse ancient forest. Agrafena found the herd a mile later. They were huddled together in a sheltered valley, instinctively seeking the highest, most protected ground. They were tired, hungry, and traumatized, but intact. The 300 animals were accounted for. She walked among them, her presence a silent, calming authority. She checked the calves, examined the wounds of the buck that had been attacked, and reassured the nervous mothers. Her final duty was to secure their food source. She used the heavy axe, now her primary tool, to chip away at the rock-hard snow and ice, exposing the vital, grey-green lichen beneath. It was exhausting work, but necessary. When the herd began to feed, tearing at the ancient food source, Agrafena finally stopped. She stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the fire she had started back on the bank, a distant, flickering memory. The sun, still pale, was beginning its slow arc toward the horizon, promising a night that would plunge the temperatures even deeper. She was alive, the herd was alive, the lineage was secure. She looked back toward the vast, empty expanse of the Lena Delta, now swallowed by the distance and the gathering shadows. The 10 bears were still out there, hungry and dangerous, but they were separated from the herd by miles of difficult terrain and the psychological barrier of the wide, deadly fissure. Agrafena Petrova, 88 years old, deaf and alone, had faced the Kolod and the apex predators, and through ancestral wisdom, tenacity, and the loyalty of a single dog, she had prevailed. The transformation was complete. She had started the journey as the guardian of a fragile legacy. She ended it as the embodiment of the Arctic's relentless will. Her purpose, once a heavy burden, was now a simple, profound truth: survival. She knelt beside Kolod, who was resting his head on his paws, watching the feeding herd. She removed her glove completely, exposing the ravaged, frost-bitten skin of her hand. The pain was dull now, a constant heavy ache. The skin was ruined, but the hand was functional. She would live, but the scars would be a permanent physical reminder of the 71 Tsuta confrontation. She placed her damaged hand on Kolod's warm fur. The silence was no longer a pressure of impending doom, but the vast, empty peace of the Siberian Arctic returning to its natural, brutal rhythm. The crisis had passed. The cycle of life and cold continued. Agrafena Petrova closed her eyes, feeling the deep, soundless thrum of the earth beneath her. The only sound she had ever truly known. It was the sound of eternal permafrost, the sound of endurance, the sound of the Petrova lineage continuing its long, silent journey across the frozen wastes.